presumably. So, Industrial Revolution myth and reality is what we're going to play with today. So we have this wonderful phrase in history, right? Industrial Revolution. I have to start with a basic definition of it. So industrial means the change from hand production to power-driven machine production. That's what industrial is. So in the pre-industrial age, humans crafted things by hand, either using their own power or some type of natural resource, water or animal power. Wind power. On the other hand, in the industrial age, there are machines driven by fossil fuels. Whoa. Yes. I tell you this because there are people that will talk about industrialization before the Industrial Revolution. So there were machines before the Industrial Revolution, but those were not industrial machines. Those were some type of traditional machines. The Romans had mills. They had water mills, windmills. The Industrial Revolution is fundamentally different because it harnesses fossil fuels. The second part of this word, right, this phrase is revolution, which suggests something that is sudden and dramatic. The idea comes from the French Revolution. French revolutionaries cut the king's head off. That was sudden and dramatic. So the question is, was this change, right, this change from hand production to machine production, sudden and dramatic? Well, we also have to then look at the implications of this. The move from rural life to urban life. In pre-industrial societies, the vast majority of people lived in rural areas because they were engaged in agriculture. In urban, right, societies, people are engaged in some type of industrial activity. Machines make urban living possible. Now, were there cities before the Industrial Revolution? Yes. But what did those cities do?
Spread disease.
Traded goods, services.
They were commercial centers, right, instead of industrial centers. But even more important than the commercial centers, or bigger than the commercial centers, what were the biggest cities in the pre-industrial world?
Capitals of kingdoms.
Capitals of kingdoms, right? So they had the palace of the power. So these were power places, and because power attracts money, money attracts commerce, the first and most important thing for a city to be in the pre-industrial age was a capital city. And then because it had the gold, merchants came because that's what merchants chase. Which meant that these were unique rather than normal in the human experience. Most people dug in the dirt, pulled out roots. Only a very few people lived in cities, and even a fewer amount of people actually lived in palaces. Most people in urban areas did what?
Spread disease.
Spread diseases, yes. So, another implication of the Industrial Revolution is the move from home production to factory production. In pre-industrial societies, goods were made at home. Even if there were a machine, the machine was in the home. There was no going to work. People worked from home. So this whole big, oh my God, I'm telecommuting. I'm working from home, as if it's something novel. No, going to work is what is novel, right? Being a commuter is novel because most people don't want to walk in a pre-industrial age. And so what do? They work from home. It's only with the advent of the Industrial Revolution do people start going to work. Huh?
I said, Malone sounds no cute.
For the change from independence to dependence. In pre-industrial societies, most workers answered to themselves. Most workers. Right? A farmer decides, I'm getting up and I'm going out. And when is a farmer done with work?
Sometimes.
Or whenever they decide, I'm going home.
About lunchtime.
About lunchtime, yeah, there you go. It's forenoon, it's noon, it's afternoon. Sun going down, let's go. How often do farmers drink coffee?
No.
Not enough. Yeah.
Yeah, you would think.
Yeah, we're gonna go feed store and go do some work. They're gonna sit around for 3 or 4 hours and drink coffee.
And gossip.
They do
like
not
little old
gossip.
ladies.
They're
I have firsthand experience.
they are
with my grandpa,
not
yes.
gossiping. They are talking
No, they're
serious.
You know, those
My
conversations
uncle, my
actually
step
change.
uncle, who was a farmer, gossiped all the time. He was the biggest
It's
gossiper.
also sin.
In industrial societies, in the post-industrial world, there's accountability for every worker. They have to punch a clock. They have to sign in, they have to sign out. Every aspect of their day is monitored. And with our wonderful machines, they will track your emails, they will track your web history,
Every little thing.
every little thing you do. So if you're shopping during the day and they find out you're shopping, you could get fired. They'll monitor your Facebook posts. If you have something you shouldn't have there, you get fired. Right? Whereas if you're a farmer, you can walk out of your house and piss off your porch, and no one cares. Freedom.
Very good.
So while there is a technical or a technological definition of this industrial revolution, just as important are the social or the wider implications for how people live their lives. And the question is, did this happen sudden and dramatically? Was it like a French Revolution that was from 1789 to 1799, right? A 10-year window? Did this happen like boom? Was it like an American Revolution? Even if you start the American Revolution at 1763 and you end the American Revolution at 1783, that's a 20-year period. Was this a 20-year period? No. We're talking about a several 100-year change in behavior. And 1800 was really sort of the pivot point at which you move from one side of this equation to start to go to the other, right? It's the tipping point. So throughout the 18th century, or where the precursors to industrialization, right? That's why it's called the early modern period, right? There are things that start to happen as early as 1500 in the way work is organized and people do things. But it's not until you get after 1800 that this begins to, quote, pick up steam. That's funny. So, why do we even have this? Well, because historians are fundamentally conservative. They find a word and they use the word, and they really don't think about the word because they keep using it until someone says you shouldn't do that anymore.
Hey, that sounds cool.
Excuse me?
Oh, hey, Industrial Revolution, hey, that sounds cool.
So where does this phrase come from? Well, this phrase comes from Arnold Toynbee, right? He coined it. Who was Arnold Toynbee then? He was a lecturer in England, and he had a series of lectures called Lectures on the Industrial Revolution, 1884. And he's the one that first really identified what had been going on in the previous 200 years. Now, Toynbee was a socialist. And when he looked at the Industrial Revolution, he focused on exploitation. that the factory owners, the capitalists, had fundamentally changed production to the detriment of laborers. So that in the pre-industrial society, laborers owned the means of production. Right? So a blacksmith owned their anvil. A blacksmith owned their furnace. A miller owned their mill. A miller controlled the selling of the bread, right? The miller would, or the flour, the miller would go buy wheat, mill it, sell flour. A baker would buy flour, have his own bakery, own the oven, right? And so the laborer owned the means of production and distribution themselves. They didn't rely on anybody else. But if someone's working in a factory, right, if I'm a factory worker, do I own any part of the factory? No, right? So there is an alienation of labor, right? This is a phrase that comes from Karl Marx, an alienation of labor, where the worker is separated from ownership. That was a fundamental change. And so what happened to the status of workers because of this change from being an owner of property to a wage earner? Did go down, right? That's pretty cool. It went down. So was it like a cliff down, or was it just like, oh, that's a downer?
Pretty sharp.
It was a pretty sharp downfall. It was pretty miserable. And so Arnold Toynbee talked about and emphasized the negative consequences of the Industrial Revolution, because if you emphasize or criticize something like exploitation, do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
Good thing he's bringing it up.
Why would you bring it up if from a socialist point of view? What do you want to happen?
Improve.
You want it to improve, and particularly you want to go back to the factory workers owning the means of production and distribution, to get rid of industrial capitalism, because industrial capitalism was miserable for the vast majority of people by the end of the 19th century. And so he wants a change in society. And so when he writes this lectures on the Industrial Revolution, he wants to convince people how miserable it was, so that he can impact what he believes is the solution to the problems of industrial capitalism, which would be public ownership of property, and that by the factory owners, by the factory workers owning property, they could then improve their own conditions because the owners get the benefits of property. If the owners are a select few, then a select few get the benefits of property. If a vast majority of the masses have ownership of property, then the masses get the benefit of it. Arnold Toynbee coined this term. Moving into the mid-20th century, a group of American economists or economic historians start talking about different aspects of the Industrial Revolution. Because by the mid-20th century, what had happened to the condition of workers across the Western world? By the mid-20th century, it had declined.
Oh, mid-20th.
The mid-20th century, if you compare mid-20th century to 1884, what had been the condition of workers? It went up. It dramatically improved, right? This is the period that all of a sudden you get the building of a middle class. You get suburban life. You get washing machines, dryers, radios, movies, all the things that the people in the Western world love, right? And so Rostow, on the other hand, wrote The Stages of Economic Growth, a non-communist manifesto in 1960. And what he pointed out was, yeah, so what would be a non-communist? What do you call that? An American, yeah. He's a capitalist, right? He is in favor of the capitalist system. And why does this make a difference in 1960?
Because no one likes communists.
It's not that no one likes communists.
Americans.
Americans.
That's what I meant.
Well, so if you're not American, you're nobody.
Yeah, exactly. Duh, haven't you heard?
So
Yeah,
what's going on in the, what's the big thing going on in the world in 1960s?
The Cold War.
The Cold War, right? So there are two competing economic systems. One is a Marxist system, and the other is a capitalist system, right? And so Roscoe cannot deny, right? He does not deny the exploitation of the early Industrial Revolution, but what he says is this was a necessary stage of economic growth, right? That the Industrial Revolution was horrible in the early 19th century. It was horrible in the late 19th century. But these were simply stages of economic growth, that once those growing pains ended, the growth was able to lift up all boats. And so the natural consequence of industrial capitalism then would be a growth of the economy, and that growth in the economy would lift all boats or trickle down. Which means, if you're a policymaker, should you do anything to try to eliminate the growing pains in the beginning? No, because they're necessary. They're a necessary part of the growing economy. And if you stop the growing pains, what do? You stop the growth. And so the only way to do this, right? So this is a non-communist manifesto because he is telling the communists, no, you've got it all wrong, right? If you do these things, if you implement these things that undermine capitalism, you're going to undermine growth. And if you undermine growth, you're going to end up hurting workers in the long run, because in the long run, capitalism is much more successful, right? This is a Whig interpretation of history in the middle of the Cold War because it focuses on progress. It does not ignore the harshness of the early Industrial Revolution, but it says that it was necessary, or in the long run, it would be better. Now, closely related to that was another American historian, Phyllis Dean, and she wrote just a little bit later, The First Industrial Revolution. And so for a whole generation of historians, they were introduced to the Industrial Revolution through her work, because this became like a textbook. So if you were in college in 1967, 1968, 1970, and you were in a European history class, they would give you the First Industrial Revolution and say, here, read this. Well, what did she say? Well, she was much bolder and said, Industrial Revolution leads to affluence.
She's the sister of Paul Dean.
Are you trying to butter me up?
You beat me to it.
Right? So, what also then is happening by the 1960s in terms of a criticism of industrialization? What is a much stronger criticism, particularly in the West, of industrialization?
War, Vietnam.
Those are there, but that was sort of the environmental movement, right? So here is the Silent Spring, right? What's her name? Silent Spring. Yeah. Rachel. There you go. Rachel's right. Silent Spring.
I got it.
She's got faster with phones. Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. So this is pre-Clean Water Act, pre-Clean Air Act. Lead was a common product in gasoline, coal burning fire plants.
And paint.
Lead paint, acid rain, right? Y'all are not old enough to remember the whole acid rain, but when I was a kid, right? Pollution came out of the plants, went up into the air. The stuff came out of the plants, mixed with the water vapors, and then came down and would just either kill lakes or kill trees. Rivers caught on fire, not very nice. People just threw shit out the window because we had a disposable society. People go to Burger King, McDonald's, whatever, get their trash, throw it out the window. That's not what happens today. So because of all that, right, there were calls to restrict industrialization. And so what is Philistine telling people in her history? That if industrialization leads to affluence and you try to roll back or control industrialization, what's going to happen to society? It's going to crash, right? You're going to go back to the pre-industrialized world. They're going to take your cars. They're going to take your trucks. They're going to take your washing machines. They're going to take your air conditioners. They're going to take all the things away from you, and you're going to go back digging in the dirt. So Philistine becomes, right, key and central to trying to counteract some of these criticisms in this Cold War era, that you have also an environmental movement that becomes highly critical of industrialization. What that means then is historians, like anybody else, are just as influenced by the politics around them as they try to write histories and try to figure out what the hell is going on. And so the central theme of industrialization and industrial history has been the exploitation of workers, that this was a sudden and dramatic change, that all of a sudden Jock the turnip digger finds himself thrown into a factory and goes, whoa, what the hell is that? Right? And that machines, right, you see this in movies like Mad Max, right? Machines start to take over the world and they will end up being Skynet. So, the reality of this is that the Industrial Revolution was a gradual transition with local shocks. Was it shocking? Yes. But overall, right, if you look at the big picture, right, if you step back and look at the big picture, it's a gradual transition from one type of society to the other. But because of technology that was introduced in cities, right, particular venues, that was shocking for that particular location in a brief period of time. So it was both sudden and dramatic if you're in a factory town, but it was also long-term taking over for a while. So we're going to start with the traditional economy, looking at it, because the traditional economy really lasts all the way through the 19th century. Right? The traditional economy still, through the 19th century, was where most people engaged in their food gathering, clothes making, and shelter. But in the beginning of the 19th century, there was a localized shock called the factory system. And in that factory system, that was sudden and dramatic. The people that worked in there, that experienced that, was a very horrible experience. But you have to realize that was not everybody. So we're going to look at the extent of early 19th century industrialization and try to give a dating system of who was shocked when. So, a gradual transition with localized shocks.